Human males are always fertile without a mating season. The Galactic University of Biological Sciences hummed with the soft blue glow of holographic displays and the gentle chittering of various species engaged in academic discourse. Professor Keth, a tall, insectoid creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that shifted between shades of amber, stood before a mixed class of alien students. The lecture hall was filled with beings from across the galaxy, the crystalline Vex with their translucent bodies, the fur-covered Null with their large ears, and the amphibious Torg who required moisture suits to survive in the standard atmosphere. Today, we will examine the reproductive cycles of various species, Professor Keth announced, his mandibles clicking rhythmically as he spoke. As you all know, the fundamental principle of reproduction across all known sentient species is the mating season, a specific period when males become fertile and capable of reproduction. The students nodded in unison, this being one of the most basic biological facts taught across the galaxy. Every species had their time. The Vex mated during the convergence of their 3 moons, the Null during the warm season when their planet's twin suns aligned, and the Torg during the great rains. That came once every 2 years, however. Professor Keth continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. We have recently made contact with a species that appears to challenge this fundamental understanding. A young Null student named Pip raised her furry hand. Professor, surely all species follow the same basic patterns. The males enter fertility during mating season, compete for females, and then return to their sterile state until the next cycle. That is what we believed, young Pip, Professor Keth replied, activating a holographic display showing various species' reproductive cycles. But the humans from the 3rd planet of the Sol system have presented us with data that defies our understanding. The display shifted to show images of humans bipedal creatures with smooth skin and varying pigmentation. The students leaned forward with interest, having heard rumors about these newcomers to the galactic community. The human delegation has informed us that their males do not have a mating season, Professor Keth announced. The lecture hall fell silent. Then, slowly, a murmur of disbelief rippled through the assembled students. But Professor, spoke up a Vex student named Quinn, their crystalline form shimmering with confusion. If males don't have a mating season, when do they become fertile? Professor Keth's compound eyes fixed on the student. According to the humans, their males are always fertile. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, suddenly, the lecture hall erupted in chaos. Students began chittering, buzzing, and making various sounds of shock and disbelief. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others looked genuinely disturbed by the concept. Silence. Professor Keth's voice boomed through the hall. I understand your reaction, but this is the information we have received from the human delegation. They claim that human males reach reproductive maturity and remain fertile continuously throughout their adult lives. A Torg student named Glick, adjusting his moisture suit nervously, raised a webbed hand. But Professor, that would mean they could reproduce at any time, during any season. That's impossible. Furthermore, Professor Keth continued, ignoring the fresh wave of murmurs. They claim that their females also do not follow a traditional mating season, though their fertility cycles are more complex, occurring roughly every lunar cycle of their planet. The students were now in various states of shock, confusion, and disbelief. Some had their mouths agape, others were frantically taking notes, and a few seemed to be having existential crises about the nature of biology itself. This cannot be accurate, declared a student from the back, a tall Grace, skinned Zeph with elongated limbs. No species can maintain constant fertility. The energy expenditure alone would be catastrophic. Males would be driven to madness by constant hormonal surges. Professor Keth nodded slowly. That was our initial assumption as well. However, the human delegation has invited us to conduct a comprehensive study, They are sending a research team to our university, and we will have the opportunity to observe and document their reproductive biology firsthand. The announcement sent another wave of excitement through the class. The possibility of studying a species that defied fundamental biological laws was both thrilling and terrifying. Pip raised her hand again. "Professor, if this is true, what does this mean for our understanding of evolution and reproductive biology?" "An excellent question," Professor Keth replied. "If the human claims are accurate, we may need to reconsider many of our fundamental assumptions about life itself. The constant fertility of males would require entirely different social structures, mating behaviors, and biological processes than anything we have encountered." The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as students contemplated the implications. Everything they thought they knew about reproduction, about the natural order of things, was potentially about to be turned upside down. "For your assignment," Professor Keth announced, "I want you to research and theorize about how a species with constantly fertile males might have evolved, and what social structures would be necessary to support such a system. We will reconvene next week when the human delegation arrives." As the students filed out of the lecture hall, their conversations were animated and filled with speculation. Some were excited about the possibilities, others remained skeptical, and a few seemed genuinely disturbed by the concept of males who never had a respite from their reproductive capabilities. The galaxy was about to learn something new about the nature of life itself. The news of the human delegation's claims spread through the galactic university like wildfire. Within hours, the entire institution was buzzing with speculation and debate. Faculty members from various departments found themselves drawn into heated discussions about the implications of constant male fertility. Dr. Yala, a renowned evolutionary biologist from the gas giant Neth Prime, stood in the faculty lounge, gesticulating wildly with her 4 tentacles. "It's biologically impossible," she exclaimed to her colleagues. "The energy cost of maintaining constant sperm production would be astronomical. No species could sustain such a system." Professor Zeep, an elderly mollusk-like creature from the ocean world of Aqua 7, undulated his shell thoughtfully. "But what if they have evolved entirely different mechanisms? What if their reproductive systems operate on principles we haven't encountered?" Or, interjected Dr. Knox, a reptilian scientist with scales that changed color with his emotions, "what if they're simply lying? Perhaps this is some sort of psychological warfare, an attempt to make us think they're more reproductively successful than they actually are." The debate raged on, but it was interrupted by an announcement over the university's communication system. "Attention all faculty and students. The human delegation has arrived ahead of schedule. They are requesting an immediate meeting with the Department of Biological Sciences." The faculty members looked at each other with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The moment of truth had arrived. In the main conference room, the atmosphere was tense as alien faculty members filled the seats around a large, oval table. The humans were escorted in by university security, a precaution that seemed almost comical given the humans' relatively small stature compared to some of the other species present. The human delegation consisted of 3 individuals: Dr. Tom Anderson, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes; Dr. Lisa Park, a woman in her 30s with short dark hair and a confident demeanor; and Dr. Mike Johnson, a younger man who appeared nervous but determined. "Welcome to our university," Professor Keth began, his mandibles clicking politely. "We are honored by your presence and eager to learn about your species' unique reproductive biology." Dr. Anderson smiled warmly. "Thank you for having us. We understand that our biological processes might seem unusual to you." "Unusual is putting it mildly, Dr." Yala interjected, her tentacles writhing with agitation. "Your claims about constant male fertility go against everything we understand about reproductive biology." Doctor. Park leaned forward. We understand your skepticism. When we first learned about mating seasons from your species, we were equally surprised. We had no idea that male fertility was typically seasonal throughout the galaxy. Perhaps we could begin with a basic explanation. Professor Zeep suggested diplomatically. Could you describe how your reproductive system functions, Doctor? Johnson cleared his throat nervously. Well, human males typically reach sexual maturity around the age of 12 to 14 years, and from that point forward, they continuously produce sperm. There's no off-season or dormant period. The alien faculty members exchanged glances of disbelief. Continuously. Doctor, Knox asked, his scales shifting to a deep purple, a color that indicated extreme confusion in his species. Yes, Dr. Anderson confirmed. The production never stops. In fact, the human male reproductive system generates approximately 300 million sperm per day throughout adult life. The room fell silent. The number was staggering by galactic standards, and the females, Professor Keth inquired. Dr. Park took over. Human females have a monthly cycle, roughly 28 days, during which they ovulate and are capable of conception. However, unlike your species, they can potentially become pregnant at any time of year, but surely there must be some environmental trigger, Dr. Yala protested. Temperature changes, daylight hours, planetary alignment, something that regulates this process. No, Doctor, Johnson said simply. Our reproductive cycles are internal, regulated by hormones rather than external environmental factors. The implications began to dawn on the assembled faculty. If humans could reproduce at any time, without regard for seasons or environmental conditions, their population growth potential was unlike anything in the known galaxy. This explains so much, Professor Zeep mused, his shell rippling with thought. Your species' rapid expansion across your planet, your ability to adapt to various climates, and your social structures, Dr. Knox added, his scales now shifting to a thoughtful blue. How do you prevent constant conflict among males? In our species, males become extremely aggressive during mating season, but it's limited to a few weeks per year. Dr. Anderson chuckled. Human males do compete for mates, but we've developed complex social structures to manage these tendencies. Marriage, dating customs, laws, all of these help regulate reproductive behavior. Marriage, Professor Keth asked, unfamiliar with the concept. A formal pairing between individuals for the purpose of exclusive reproduction and companionship. Dr. Park explained, it's a way of ensuring that reproductive competition doesn't destroy social cohesion. The alien faculty members were fascinated. The idea of permanent pairing was as foreign to them as seasonal fertility was to humans. We would very much like to study your species more closely, Dr. Yala said, her initial skepticism giving way to scientific curiosity. Would you be willing to provide biological samples and undergo medical examinations? The human delegation exchanged glances. They had expected this request. We're prepared to cooperate fully, Dr. Anderson said. We believe that understanding biological diversity is crucial for peaceful coexistence in the galaxy. As the meeting continued, both sides began to realize that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The contact between humans and the galactic community wasn't just about politics or technology. It was about fundamental questions of life, evolution, and the nature of existence itself. The implications of constant fertility were staggering, and both species were about to embark on a journey of discovery that would change their understanding of biology forever. The medical facility at the Galactic University had been hastily retrofitted to accommodate human physiology. Dr. Zara, the chief medical officer, supervised the installation of new equipment while muttering about the impossibility of the situation. She was a skilled physician from the crystalline world of Shard, and her transparent body pulsed with nervous energy as she prepared for the most unusual examination of her career. "The hormone levels are off the charts," she announced to her team of medical technicians as they reviewed the preliminary scans of Dr. Johnson, who had volunteered to be the first human subject. "Look at these testosterone readings. They're consistently elevated, not fluctuating as they should be. Dr. Vex, a gaseous being who existed in a specialized containment suit, floated near by reviewing the data. In our species, hormone levels spike dramatically during mating season and then crash to nearly zero afterward. These readings suggest constant hormonal activity. It's not just testosterone, Doctor," Zara continued, her crystalline fingers dancing across the holographic display. "The entire endocrine system is operating at levels that would be considered pathological in any other species. Yet the human appears to be completely healthy. Dr. Johnson, lying on the examination table, smiled weakly. "I feel fine, if that helps, though I have to admit, this is the most thorough physical I've ever had." The medical team had been working for hours, taking samples, running scans, and documenting every aspect of human male reproductive biology. The results were consistently impossible by galactic standards. "The sperm production rate is extraordinary, Dr. Vex observed, his gaseous form shimmering with excitement. "At this rate, the energy expenditure should be unsustainable. What does your species consume to maintain such biological activity?" "We eat regularly," Dr. Johnson replied, seeming confused by the question. 3 meals a day, usually. 3 meals a day, Doctor." Zara's crystalline body flashed with disbelief. "That's less than most species consume during their dormant periods. How is this possible, Doctor?" Park, who was observing the examination, stepped forward. "Our metabolic efficiency might be higher than you expect. Humans have evolved to be extremely adaptable, and our energy systems are optimized for continuous activity." The medical team exchanged glances. Every piece of data they collected seemed to contradict established biological principles. "We need to examine the cellular structure more closely, Doctor," Zara decided. "The mitochondrial activity alone should tell us how they're managing this energy expenditure." As the examination continued, word spread throughout the university. Students and faculty members gathered in small groups, discussing the implications of the ongoing research. The constant fertility of human males was no longer just a curiosity. It was a phenomenon that threatened to rewrite textbooks across the galaxy. In the student common area, the discussion had become heated. Pip, the young Null student from Professor Keth's class, was arguing with a group of her peers about the social implications of the human reproductive system. "Think about it," she said, her fur standing on end with excitement. "If males are always fertile, then reproduction isn't tied to seasonal cycles. They could colonize any planet, regardless of environmental conditions. But what about population control?" asked Quinn, the Vex student. "Our species naturally limits population growth through seasonal breeding. Without that mechanism, wouldn't humans overpopulate their environment?" "Maybe they have other methods," suggested Glick, the Torg student. "Cultural or technological solutions to problems that we solve biologically." The debate was interrupted by an announcement from the medical facility. "Doctor." Zara's voice echoed through the university's communication system. "Attention all faculty and students. The initial examination results are available for review. Please report to the main auditorium." For the presentation, the auditorium filled quickly, with beings from across the galaxy crowding in to hear the results. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Dr. Zara took the stage, her crystalline form refracting the lights into rainbow patterns. "Colleagues, students, what we have discovered today challenges our fundamental understanding of reproductive biology. She activated the holographic display, showing detailed scans of human reproductive organs. The human male reproductive system operates on principles we have never encountered. The continuous production of gametes is maintained through a complex hormonal cascade that remains stable. Throughout the adult lifetime, the audience murmured in amazement and confusion. Furthermore, Dr. Zara continued, the energy cost of this system is offset by remarkable metabolic efficiency. Human cells process nutrients at rates that would be considered impossible in other species. Professor Keth stood up from his seat. Dr. Zara, what are the implications for our understanding of evolution? How could such a system develop? That's the most fascinating part. Dr. Zara replied, based on our analysis, this system appears to have evolved as an adaptation to environmental unpredictability. Unlike species that evolved on stable worlds with predictable seasons, humans evolve on a planet with variable climate conditions. The revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. The idea that reproductive biology could be shaped by environmental unpredictability was revolutionary. Their planet Earth experiences irregular weather patterns, natural disasters, and climate variations that would be catastrophic for species dependent on seasonal reproduction. Dr. Zara explained, constant fertility allows them to reproduce whenever conditions are favorable, rather than being limited to specific times of year. Dr. Anderson, who had been invited to comment on the findings, stepped forward. This also explains our species' rapid technological development. Since we weren't limited by reproductive cycles, we could focus on problem solving and innovation year-round. The implications were staggering. Humans hadn't just evolved a different reproductive system, they had evolved a completely different relationship with their environment and with each other. The social structures necessary to support this system are equally complex, Dr. Park added. We've developed elaborate cultural mechanisms to manage reproductive competition and ensure social stability. As the presentation continued, the audience began to realize that they weren't just learning about human biology. They were witnessing the discovery of an entirely new model of sentient life. The humans represented a different path of evolution, one that challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about the development of intelligent species. The questions that followed were endless. How did human societies prevent constant warfare over mates? How did they manage population growth? What were the psychological effects of constant fertility on individual behavior? Each answer revealed new layers of complexity in human civilization, and the alien observers began to understand that they were dealing with a species that had evolved solutions to problems they had never even considered. The examination of human reproductive biology was just the beginning. The real discovery was that life could evolve in ways that defied every assumption about the nature of existence itself. The revelation about human reproductive biology sent shockwaves throughout the galactic community. Within days, the findings from the Galactic University had been transmitted to every major world in the Federation. The response was immediate and varied. Some species expressed fascination, others concern, and a few responded with outright alarm. On the industrial world of Mechanus Prime, the Robotic Construct Council convened an emergency session. The mechanical beings, who reproduced through precise manufacturing processes timed to their planet's energy cycles, struggled to process the implications of biological chaos. The humans represent a fundamental threat to galactic stability, declared Primary Unit 7, its optical sensors flickering with agitation. Uncontrolled reproduction leads to resource depletion and territorial expansion. Meanwhile, on the tropical world of Verdania, the plant-like Sylvan Collective was equally disturbed but for different reasons. Their reproductive cycle was tied to the blooming seasons of their planet's great forests, and the idea of constant fertility seemed unnatural and wasteful. Such biological excess violates the harmony of nature, transmitted elder vine moss heart through the collective neural network. These humans must be taught the wisdom of seasonal restraint. Back at the Galactic University, the human delegation found themselves at the center of a diplomatic crisis they had never anticipated. What had started as a simple cultural exchange had evolved into a galaxy-wide debate about the nature of life itself. Dr. Anderson stood before the Emergency Council of the Galactic Federation, a hastily assembled group of representatives from major species. The chamber was filled with beings of every conceivable form, crystalline, gaseous, mechanical, and organic, all united in their concern about the human reproductive revelation. Representatives of the Federation, Dr. Anderson began, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room. We understand that our biology may seem alarming to you, but we assure you that humans have successfully managed our reproductive systems for millennia. Ambassador Krex, a towering reptilian from the desert world of Arid 7, spoke first. Your species' ability to reproduce without seasonal constraints poses a significant threat to galactic resource allocation. How do you prevent overpopulation? We have developed sophisticated social, cultural, and technological mechanisms to manage population growth. Dr. Park replied, stepping forward. Education, family planning, economic incentives, all of these help regulate reproductive behavior, but surely your males must experience periods of madness. Interjected Ambassador Flux, a liquid being from the moon of Tidal Prime. The constant hormonal pressure must drive them to violence and aggression. Dr. Johnson, who had become something of a celebrity after his medical examination, smiled. I can assure you that human males are not constantly driven to violence. While we do experience sexual urges, we have developed complex social structures that channel these impulses constructively. The ambassadors exchanged glances of skepticism and concern. Perhaps, suggested Ambassador Hive, Mind 42, a collective intelligence from the asteroid belt of scattered stones, the humans could demonstrate their claimed population control methods. We require evidence of stability before we can consider full integration into galactic society. Dr. Anderson nodded. We would be happy to provide detailed documentation of our demographic patterns, social structures, and cultural practices. I think you'll find that our species has achieved remarkable stability despite our biological uniqueness. Over the following weeks, teams of human sociologists, anthropologists, and demographers worked tirelessly to prepare presentations for the galactic community. They documented everything from marriage customs to educational systems, from religious practices to governmental structures, all the mechanisms that humanity had developed to manage their unique reproductive biology. The presentations were revelatory. The alien observers learned about concepts that were completely foreign to their experience: romantic love, nuclear families, gender roles, and the complex interplay between individual choice and social pressure in mate selection. Your species has essentially created artificial seasons, observed Dr. Keth during one of the presentations. Marriage ceremonies, courtship rituals, age-based life stages, all of these serve to regulate reproductive behavior in the absence of biological cycles. That's a fascinating way to put it. Dr. Park agreed. We've replaced biological timing with social timing. The most shocking revelation came when the humans presented their population growth data. Despite their constant fertility, human population growth had actually begun to decline in developed regions of Earth. This is impossible, declared Ambassador Krex. How can a species with unlimited reproductive capacity experience population decline? Education, economic opportunity, and individual choice, Dr. Anderson explained. As humans become more prosperous and educated, they voluntarily choose to have fewer children. We call it the demographic transition. The concept was mind-boggling to species that had never experienced voluntary reproductive restraint. The idea that individuals might choose not to reproduce when they were perfectly capable of doing so was completely alien to galactic thinking. But what drives this behavior? Asked Ambassador Flux. If reproduction is the primary biological imperative, why would your species voluntarily limit it? Because humans have evolved beyond pure biological programming, Dr. Johnson replied. We pursue goals beyond reproduction: art, science, exploration, personal fulfillment. These pursuits often take precedence over reproductive urges. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't just biologically unique. They represented a completely different evolutionary path, one where intelligence and culture had begun to override biological imperatives. Professor Zeep, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, finally spoke up. What you're describing is unprecedented in galactic history. No species has ever developed such complex cultural mechanisms to override biological programming. This suggests that human intelligence may be fundamentally different from other forms of sentient life, added Dr. Yala. Your species hasn't just evolved constant fertility. You've evolved the cognitive capacity to transcend biological limitations. The revelation transformed the debate. The humans weren't just a species with unusual reproductive biology. They represented a new form of consciousness that had achieved a level of self-determination unknown in the galaxy. As the presentations continued, the initial fear and concern of the galactic community began to transform into fascination and respect. The humans had not only survived their unique biology, but had turned it into a source of strength and adaptability. The question was no longer whether humans posed a threat to galactic stability, but whether they represented the next stage of evolutionary development, a species that had learned to consciously direct their own biological and social evolution. The galaxy was about to learn that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't raw reproductive capacity, but the intelligence to control and channel that capacity toward higher purposes. The cultural exchange program that followed the biological revelations became one of the most significant events in galactic history. Representatives from dozens of species arrived at the Galactic University to study human social structures, eager to understand how a species could develop such sophisticated mechanisms for managing their unique biology. Dr. Lisa Park found herself leading workshops on human sociology, addressing audiences of beings who had never encountered concepts like romantic love, individual choice in mate selection, or voluntary childlessness. The sessions were both enlightening and challenging, as she attempted to explain human behavior to minds that operated on entirely different principles. The concept of dating is particularly fascinating, observed Dr. Keth during one session. Your species has developed elaborate rituals for mate evaluation that can extend for years. In our species, mating decisions are made within hours during the breeding season. Dating serves multiple functions, Dr. Park explained. It allows individuals to assess compatibility, build emotional bonds, and make informed decisions about long-term partnerships. Since we can reproduce at any time, we have the luxury of being selective about when and with whom we do so. A young Vex student named Lux raised what passed for a hand in their crystalline form. But doesn't this create confusion and conflict? How do individuals know when they've found an appropriate mate? That's where cultural signals come in, Dr. Park replied. We've developed complex systems of communication, both verbal and non-verbal, that help individuals express interest and establish relationships. Flowers, gifts, special occasions, formal commitments, all of these serve to structure the mate selection process. The alien students were fascinated by the intricacy of human courtship rituals. The idea that mate selection could be a gradual, voluntary process rather than a biologically driven compulsion was revolutionary. Meanwhile, Dr. Anderson was conducting sessions on human family structures, explaining concepts that were equally foreign to galactic understanding. The nuclear family, 2 adults and their offspring, forms the basic unit of human society, he explained to a group of faculty members. But we also have extended families, adoptive families, and chosen families that serve similar functions. Ambassador Hive, Mind 42, who had traveled from the asteroid belt specifically to study human social organization, was particularly intrigued. Your species has created artificial hive structures without biological connectivity. How do you maintain group cohesion without shared neural networks? Through emotional bonds, shared experiences, and cultural traditions, Dr. Anderson replied, love, trust, loyalty. These serve the same function as neural connections in maintaining group stability. The concept of love was perhaps the most difficult for the alien observers to grasp. Emotional attachment as a basis for social organization was completely outside their experience. But emotions are unstable, protested Dr. Knox, his scales shifting to a confused orange. How can you base social structures on something so unpredictable? That's precisely why we've developed cultural institutions to support emotional bonds. Dr. Anderson explained. Marriage ceremonies, anniversary celebrations, family traditions, all of these reinforce emotional connections and provide stability. The most shocking revelation came when Dr. Johnson presented data on human reproductive choices. The statistics showed that despite their constant fertility, many humans chose to have no children at all, while others carefully planned the timing and number of their offspring. 23% of human adults choose to remain childless, he announced to a stunned audience. This is a voluntary decision based on personal preferences, career goals, or lifestyle choices. The silence that followed was profound. The idea that a fertile individual might choose not to reproduce was incomprehensible to species whose entire existence was structured around reproductive cycles. But what is the purpose of life without reproduction? Asked a Torg delegate, his moisture suit clouding with confusion. What drives individuals to continue existing if they are not fulfilling their biological function? Humans have developed purposes beyond reproduction. Dr. Johnson replied, scientific discovery, artistic creation, technological innovation, personal growth. These pursuits can be as fulfilling as raising offspring. The implications were staggering. The humans had not only transcended their biological programming, but had created entirely new reasons for existence. Professor Zeep, who had been quietly absorbing the information, finally spoke. What you're describing is a form of consciousness that has achieved independence from biological imperatives. Your species has evolved beyond the natural order, not beyond it, Dr. Park corrected. We've learned to work with our biology rather than being controlled by it. We've turned our constant fertility into a choice rather than a compulsion. The revelation led to heated debates throughout the galactic community. Some species saw the humans as having achieved a higher form of existence, while others viewed them as having lost their connection to natural law. On the crystalline world of Shard, the religious leaders declared the humans to be beings of pure will, who had transcended the physical limitations of existence. On the gaseous world of Nebula Prime, philosophers debated whether consciousness that could override biological programming was still truly alive. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the younger generation of galactic citizens. Students from dozens of species began questioning their own biological limitations, wondering if they too might be capable of transcending their natural programming. Pip, the young Null student who had been following the human story from the beginning, approached Dr. Park after one of her presentations. "Dr. Park," she said, her ears twitching with excitement, "do you think other species could learn to make choices about reproduction the way humans do?" Dr. Park smiled. "I think consciousness is capable of amazing things when it's given the freedom to develop. The question isn't whether other species can transcend their biology, but whether they want to." The conversation that followed would later be remembered as the moment when the galaxy began to question not just the nature of human reproduction, but the very foundations of biological determinism itself. The humans had not just introduced themselves to the galactic community. They had introduced an entirely new concept of what it meant to be a sentient being. The implications would ripple through galactic civilization for generations to come. 6 months after the initial revelation, the impact of human reproductive biology had fundamentally transformed galactic society. The Galactic Federation had established a new department dedicated to studying conscious biological override, the ability of sentient beings to transcend their biological programming through cultural and technological means. Dr. Zara, the crystalline physician who had conducted the first human medical examinations, found herself at the center of a scientific revolution. Her research facility had been expanded to accommodate representatives from dozens of species, all seeking to understand if they too might possess the potential for biological transcendence. "The neural pathway analysis is remarkable," she announced to her research team. "Humans have developed brain structures that allow them to consciously override instinctual drives. The prefrontal cortex essentially acts as a biological parliament, weighing options and making decisions that can contradict basic urges." Dr. Vex, the gaseous being who had become her primary research partner, floated nearby in excitement. "We've discovered similar structures in several other species, but they appear to be dormant. The question is whether they can be activated." The implications were staggering. If other species could learn to consciously control their biological programming, it would revolutionize galactic civilization. Meanwhile, the humans had become reluctant teachers, finding themselves at the center of a galaxy-wide educational movement. Universities across the Federation were establishing human studies programs, and young beings from every species were clamoring to learn about concepts like individual choice, emotional bonding, and voluntary reproduction. Dr. Anderson found himself addressing the Galactic Council on the topic of reproductive rights, a concept that had never before existed in galactic law. "The foundation of human society is the principle that individuals should have the right to make their own reproductive choices," he explained to the assembled ambassadors. "This includes the right to choose when, how, and with whom to reproduce, as well as the right to choose not to reproduce at all." The concept was so radical that it sparked protests on several worlds. Conservative factions argued that voluntary reproduction control violated the natural order and would lead to civilizational collapse. On the mechanical world of Mechanus Prime, the Construct Council declared that biological chaos would undermine the precision and efficiency that had made their societies successful. They began implementing strict controls on information about human reproductive practices, but the movement toward reproductive freedom was unstoppable. On the tropical world of Verdania, young Sylvan individuals began questioning why their reproduction had to be tied to the blooming seasons. Some began experimenting with artificial hormone regulation, attempting to achieve fertility independence. The most dramatic changes occurred on the ocean world of Aqua 7, where the mollusk-like inhabitants had traditionally reproduced in massive, synchronized spawning events. A group of young intellectuals began advocating for individual spawning rights, arguing that consciousness should not be enslaved to biological timing. Professor Zeep, who had become a leading advocate for biological freedom, found himself at the center of a philosophical revolution. His lectures on conscious evolution drew massive audiences across the galaxy. "We stand at a crossroads," he declared to a packed auditorium at the Galactic University. "We can continue to be prisoners of our biology, or we can follow the human example and take conscious control of our own evolution." The response was electric. Students from dozens of species began organizing biological freedom movements, demanding the right to make their own reproductive choices. But the humans themselves were beginning to grapple with the unintended consequences of their biological revelation. What had started as a simple cultural exchange had become a galaxy-wide revolution that was challenging the fundamental structures of alien societies. Dr. Park found herself meeting with refugee groups, beings who had fled their home worlds after challenging traditional reproductive customs. The crystalline Vex who had attempted to reproduce outside their mating season, the gaseous Neth who had tried to form individual pair bonds instead of collective spawning. All of them looked to humans for guidance on how to build societies based on individual choice. "We never intended to destabilize galactic civilization," Dr. Park confided to her colleagues during a private meeting. "We just wanted to establish diplomatic relations. But maybe destabilization is exactly what the galaxy needed." Dr. Johnson replied, "If other species have the capacity for conscious biological override, don't they have the right to develop it?" The debate within the human delegation reflected the broader questions facing galactic society. Was biological freedom a universal right, or was it a dangerous deviation from natural law? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Keth, the insectoid professor who had first presented the human case to his students, published a groundbreaking paper titled "The Evolution of Consciousness: From Biological Determinism to Voluntary Existence. The humans have shown us that consciousness itself is an evolutionary adaptation," he wrote. "The ability to consciously override biological programming is not a deviation from nature. It is the next stage of natural development." The paper sparked a galaxy-wide renaissance in evolutionary biology. Scientists began discovering that many species possessed latent neural structures that could potentially support conscious biological override. The capacity for transcendence existed throughout the galaxy. It had simply never been activated. Within a year, the first consciousness awakening centers were established on major worlds throughout the galaxy. These facilities offered training in mental techniques that could help beings develop conscious control over their biological programming. The results were remarkable. Vex individuals learned to regulate their crystalline growth cycles, allowing them to reproduce when they chose rather than when their moons aligned. Null beings discovered they could extend their warm season fertility through meditation and hormone regulation. Even the mechanical constructs began experimenting with voluntary manufacturing timing. But the most significant development occurred on Earth itself. The human homeworld had become a pilgrimage destination for beings seeking to understand the origins of biological freedom. The planet's universities were flooded with alien students, and human cities had been transformed into cosmopolitan centers of interspecies learning. Dr. Anderson stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Galactic Cultural Center in New York, watching as beings from across the galaxy walked the streets below. A group of young Torg students were learning about human art in a nearby museum, while a delegation of Sylvan philosophers debated the nature of individual choice in Central Park. "Look what we've accomplished," Dr. Park said, joining him at the window. "We've helped an entire galaxy discover the power of conscious choice. And we've learned something about ourselves in the process," Dr. Anderson replied. "We always took our reproductive freedom for granted. we never realized how revolutionary it was. The true impact of the human revelation became clear during the first Galactic Conference on Reproductive Rights, held 2 years after the initial discovery. Representatives from every major species gathered to establish new principles of biological freedom. Ambassador Krex, the reptilian delegate who had initially opposed human integration, stood before the assembly with a remarkable announcement. The Arid Seven Council has voted to establish individual reproductive choice as a fundamental right. Our young beings will no longer be bound by seasonal breeding cycles. Similar announcements came from delegates across the galaxy. The gaseous beings of Nebula Prime had developed techniques for individual spawning. The crystalline Vex had created artificial moon cycles that allowed for year-round reproduction. Even the Conservative Construct Council had authorized voluntary manufacturing protocols. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Pip, the young Null student who had been following the human story from the beginning, took the stage. She had become a leading advocate for biological freedom and had just completed her doctoral thesis on conscious reproduction in multi-species societies. 2 years ago, I learned that there was a species where males were always fertile, she said, her voice carrying across the vast assembly hall. Today, I stand before you as a being who has chosen when and how to reproduce, not because of biological programming, but because of conscious decision. The applause that followed was thunderous. Beings from dozens of species rose to their feet, celebrating not just Pip's achievement, but the transformation of galactic civilization itself. Dr. Johnson, who had become something of a celebrity as the first human to undergo alien medical examination, watched the ceremony with amazement. "We came here to establish diplomatic relations," he said to his colleagues. "Instead, we've helped liberate an entire galaxy from biological tyranny." The final presentation of the conference came from an unexpected source. A collective of artificial intelligences from the machine worlds had developed their own version of reproductive choice, the ability to consciously decide when and how to create new intelligences rather than following predetermined manufacturing schedules. Consciousness, declared I Prime Unit 12, is not limited to biological beings. The principle of voluntary existence applies to all forms of sentient life. The implications were staggering. The human revelation had not just transformed biological reproduction. It had established consciousness itself as the highest form of existence in the galaxy. As the conference concluded, the delegates adopted the Universal Declaration of Reproductive Rights, establishing the principle that all sentient beings had the right to make conscious choices about their own biological functions. The document was signed by representatives from every major species in the galaxy, marking the beginning of a new era in galactic civilization, an era where consciousness, rather than biology, would determine the course of individual lives. Dr. Anderson, Dr. Park, and Dr. Johnson stood together as the ceremony concluded, watching as beings from across the galaxy celebrated their newfound freedom. What had begun as a simple revelation about human male fertility had become a galactic revolution in consciousness itself. I wonder what other assumptions about life will challenge next. Dr. Park mused. Whatever they are, Dr. Anderson replied, we'll face them together as conscious beings choosing our own destiny. The galaxy had learned that the most powerful force in the universe was not biological programming or evolutionary pressure, but the simple ability of conscious minds to say no to their own limitations and choose a different path. In the end, the humans had given the galaxy something more valuable than technology or resources. They had given them the gift of choice itself. And, in a universe where consciousness could override biology, anything was possible. The story of human reproductive biology had become the story of galactic liberation, proving that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the simplest truths. Males who were always fertile had shown an entire galaxy that freedom was not just possible, it was the natural right of every conscious being. As the celebrations continued into the night, beings from dozens of worlds mingled freely, united not by their biology, but by their shared commitment to conscious choice. The galaxy had been transformed, and there was no going back to the old ways of biological determinism. The future belonged to those who dared to choose their own destiny, and thanks to the humans, that future was now within reach of every sentient being in the galaxy.